Images play a very important role in the narrative of H.P. Lovecraft's story, The Call of Cthulhu, and they basically come in two different varieties. We have nearly three-dimensional bas-reliefs, which when you read that, what that means is sort of a statue that is coming out of a wall, you could say. And then we have actual statuary, three-dimensional depictions of something. As we're going to find out, these are all depictions of the same Great Old One Cthulhu, but we get sort of introduced to the idea as it goes along, and there's some other really important revelations that get made, particularly in the second part, then reinforced in the third part. So we begin with a curious little artifact within the papers of the narrator's granduncle, George Gamble Angle, Professor Emeritus of Semitic Languages. So he finds within this locked box a whole bunch of documents, and then this queer clay bas-relief. And he says it was a rough rectangle, less than 1 inch thick and about 5 by 6 inches in area, obviously of modern origin. Its designs, however, were far from modern in atmosphere and suggestion, for although the vagaries of Cubism and Futurism are many and while two important artistic movements, we could say, in the 20th century, they do not often reproduce that cryptic regularity which lurks in prehistoric writing. So we have a sort of intimation of futurity, we could say, and then we have prehistoric writing. And he says, writing of some kind, the bulk of which these designs certainly seem to be. I failed to identify this particular species or even hint at its remotest affiliations. And so we've got what he's going to call hieroglyphics above these apparent hieroglyphics. Now, when we read that word, we typically think of Egypt first, right? And of sort of picture writing. And let's actually go back to an earlier meaning of the term. So the glyphics, we've got writing of some sort, graphic, right? Hero, holy. It's connected with something that is either sacred or its opposite, not the profane, but the horrifying, we could say. Things that people could worship. So he goes on and he says, its impressionistic execution forbade a clear idea of its nature. What is the figure that is above these? It is going to be an image, a sort of monster or symbol representing a monster, or a form which only a diseased fancy could conceive. Now, notice there, he's already suggested, first, it's a monster, or maybe a symbol, not an image, not a representation, a symbol representing a monster. So maybe it's not the monster itself, right? Or, going further, a form only a diseased fancy could conceive. So not something that a healthy, normal person could ever come up with. And what is it? He says, if I say that my somewhat extravagant imagination yields simultaneous pictures of an octopus, a dragon, and a human caricature, I should not be unfaithful to the spirit of the thing. A pulpy, tentacled head surmounted by a grotesque and scaly body with rudimentary wings, but it was the general outline of the whole which made it shockingly frightful. So we get a depiction here, a description of what it is that this monster looks like. And then we get behind it a vague suggestion of a cyclopean architectural background. And this cyclopean is a term that's going to get used at several points. Lovecraft really likes this term in his works in general. And you could think back to what were the Cyclopses? Well, these legendary, deformed creatures that got into all sorts of trouble, but were gigantic as well. So we find out that this was actually produced by an art student, Wilcox, who calls upon Professor Angle carrying the bas-relief, damp and fresh. And it turns out that he wants to consult Engel to find out what are the hieroglyphics, what does the writing mean? And Professor Engel isn't able to say anything. Turns out that this is coming from dreams, right? So this is our first introduction. And the narrator actually sees this image there as well as reads his uncle's account. Then we get the second document, and this takes us backwards in time. So we have Inspector Legrasse's consultation, who is coming to a learned society, which is meeting the American Archaeological Society, to ask them about an artifact that he seized in a raid. We find out it is a grotesque, repulsive, and apparently very ancient stone statuette whose origin he was at a loss to determine. So he's going to experts and saying, can you determine where this actually came from? And we find out Inspector Legrasse was scarcely prepared for the sensation which his offering created. One sight of the thing had been enough to throw the assembled men of science into a state of tense excitement, and they lost no time in crowding about him to gaze at the diminutive figure whose utter strangeness, an air of genuinely abysmal antiquity, hinted so potently at an unopened and archaic vistas. No recognized school of sculpture had animated this terrible object, yet centuries and even thousands of years seemed recorded in its dim and greenish surface of unplaceable stone. So what do we find out? It is indeed a worked piece, and the figure is between 7 and 8 inches in height and of exquisitely artistic workmanship. What does it represent? A monster of vaguely anthropoid outline, but with an octopus-like head, whose face was a mass of feelers, a scaly, rubbery-looking body, prodigious claws on hind and forefeet, and long, narrow wings behind. So we're getting a fuller description now of the monster. This thing, which seemed instinct with a fearsome and unnatural malignancy, was of a somewhat bloated corpulence and squatted evilly on a rectangular block or pedestal covered with undecipherable characters, right? And we find out its vast, awesome, and incalculable age was unmistakable, yet not one link did it show with any known type of art belonging to civilization's youth, or indeed any time. And we're also going to find out that they can't determine what kind of stone this is. Its very material was a mystery, for the soapy greenish-black stone with its golden or iridescent flecks and striations resembled nothing familiar to geology or mineralogy. So we have actually two mysteries at this point. We have, what the hell is this creature? What is this writing? Or actually, what is this stone? And then we're going to get to what is this writing again. The characters were equally baffling. No member present, despite a representation of half the world's expert learning in the field, could form the least notion of even their remotest linguistic kinship. They, like the subject and material, belong to something horribly remote and distinct from mankind as we know it, something frighteningly suggestive of old and unhallowed cycles of life, in which our world and our conceptions have no part. So, now when we've actually got the statue, we've got like three mysteries intersecting with each other. The creature, the material, what this writing is actually saying. Then we get another image coming in from yet an older account. Professor William Channing Webb, who is from Princeton University. He had been engaged in a tour of Greenland and Iceland in search of runic inscriptions. He runs into a tribe or cult of degenerate Inuit whose religion, a curious form of devil worship, chilled him with its deliberate bloodthirstiness and repulsiveness. And what does he find out? They also have a bas-relief, which is, as he says, their fetish, meaning the thing that they use to worship some sort of divine force. Just now of prime significance was the fetish which this cult had cherished and around which they had danced when the aurora leaped high over the ice cliffs. It was, the professor stated, a very crude bas-relief of stone comprising a hideous picture and some cryptic writing. And as far as he could tell, it was a rough parallel in all essential features of the bestial thing now lying before the meeting. So now we have in our story 3 different representations that all agree in the physiognomy of this thing depicted and in having this kind of writing, right? And what we're going to find out from Legrasse is that there's an entire cult around this. His men were involved in it, and they had this statue set on top of a massive granite monolith around which, well, we'll just read a little bit of this. There leaped and twisted a more indescribable horde of human abnormality than any but a Cymer and Gorilla could paint. Void of clothing, this hybrid spawn were braying, bellowing, and writhing about a monstrous ringed bonfire, in the center of which, revealed by occasional rifts in the curtain of flame, stood a great granite monolith, some 8 feet in height, on top of which, incongruous in its diminutiveness, rested the noxious carven statuette. So, after the raid, this statue is taken, and Inspector Legrasse is going to consult. And, the narrator is going to meet with Legrasse later on, but the real impetus for the rest of the story comes from a newspaper, the Sydney Bulletin, which has a story about, an interesting account of, let's call it a nautical mystery, which only one person survives from, with a picture. And the picture gets the narrator's attention. Why? The picture was a halftone cut of a hideous stone image, almost identical with that which Legrasse had found in the swamp. So he reads this account and finds out that, we'll read it. The living man, the only survivor, was clutching a horrible stone idol of unknown origin about 1 foot in height, regarding whose nature authorities at Sydney University, the Royal Society, and the museum in College Street all profess complete bafflement, and which the survivor says he found in the cabin of the yacht in a small carved shrine of common pattern. So we've got Johansson, who's found the statue. We get the same sort of theme of even our learned experts can't really figure this out. We don't know, whether they went through the same sort of what's the object, what's the material, what's this writing, but presumably they're as confused about that. And then we find out that the narrator actually goes to these different places in the story, and they get to see the statue at the museum in Hyde Park. He says, the crouching image with its cuttlefish head, dragon body, scaly wings, and hieroglyph pedestal was preserved there, and I studied it long and well, finding it a thing of balefully exquisite workmanship, and with the same utter mystery, terrible antiquity, and unearthly strangeness of material I had noted in Legrasse's smaller specimen. Geologists, the curator told me, had found it a monstrous puzzle, for they vowed that the world held no rock like it. And then we get an invocation here of something that happened a little bit earlier in the story. Castro, who had told Legrasse about the Great Old Ones. So we need to look a little bit at that, going back into the second part. What we're going to find is after the raid, as prisoners are being interrogated, we find out that no person had ever seen the Old Ones. The carven idol was Great Cthulhu, but none might say whether or not the others were precisely like him. No one could read the old writing now, but things were told by word of mouth. And then we find out from Castro, who has, sailed the seas and knows quite a bit. He remembered bits of hideous legend, right? And what are the relevant parts here? They, the great old ones, had come themselves from the stars and brought their images with them. So, not the bas-reliefs, which are carved by human beings, but these statues, of which in the story we have 2. These didn't come from Earth. These weren't made by human beings. These came down from the stars with the great old ones who brought them along. For what purpose, we have no idea. It turns out that they play a role in these Cthulhu cults that we find spread all over the world. And they also play a central role in the narrative. They allow us to have some sort of sense of what it is that Cthulhu looks like. And we should point out, as we close this up, so when we encounter Cthulhu in the narrative, sort of, third hand, we might say, Cthulhu is too large to easily wrap our heads around. A mountain that walks, right? But the statue allows us to conceptualize what this thing looks like, at least to the extent that we can with, as the next paragraph says, is kind of an extra-dimensional being. It's not all there in the world that we know. So these statues play a really important role in the unfolding of the narrative and the encounter with the great old one.